Imagine a world where you know there are more things to experience than what is currently right in front of you. If you're currently a bit older, you might be saying, "No duh, I've experienced lots of places while growing up, or simply in adulthood." But if you are a bit younger or less traveled, you might resonate with the longing for something different, something adventurous. When I was growing up in the Bay Area for the first 8 years of my life, I recall the many times I was both overwhelmed by the hecticness of San Francisco, but at the same time curious about the contrast in environments between the city and the lush hills and forests nearby. Being so young, I would hardly get a chance to escape the urban concrete sprawl around our neighborhood. However, there were many times my parents would take me hiking at San Bruno Mountain close to my house in Daly City, or take me to Golden Gate Park, or even the Redwood Forest a bit more north of us. There would be times where I would look out of the car window as my folks drove across the Bay Bridge, and I would wonder what experiences lay beyond the coastal hilly landscape. The closest explanation for why a child would feel this way is what we call innocence. Our lack of knowledge about reality mixed with our curiosity makes us connect to things strongly. In a phrase, we recall this experience of the world as childlike wonder. When we grow and develop into adults, we start to forget that blissful state of interest in life. We get bogged down by social expectations and the many rules and responsibilities we have to take on in order to survive and sustain ourselves, and those who might rely on us. When we feel drowned in this interruption from our pure curiosity, we turn to nostalgia, a grasping at pure interest from something in our development childlike phase of life. For me, as well as for many others, one of these anchors of nostalgia was one of the many games in the Legend of Zelda franchise. Not unlike many people born in the 90s, that first experience was with a little game for the N64 called The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Now, I'm kind of the odd one out when it comes to recalling the experiences of this game as a child, because unlike many of my friends growing up, I didn't have a game console. The only opportunities I had to experience the new wonders of 3D digital environments were at friends' houses. I remember fondly the nights I stayed over at my friend Josh's house and experienced new levels in Mario 64, spaced out over weeks of time until I had even an idea of all the diversity of levels built into it. Due to the social nature of the times I would play the N64, however, most of my experiences were playing co-op experiences like GoldenEye or Mario Kart with at least one other person. My peers were mostly too young to have owned or taken any interest in older consoles, so the knowledge I had around single-player games mostly revolved around a handful of games on the PlayStation or the N64. Much to my surprise, looking back at this time, not really any of my friends owned or at least showed me that they owned a Zelda game. So it was completely off my radar. During the later years of my San Francisco childhood, my mom's boss had taken very ill and was mostly bedridden. My mom had an office administrative position and a semi-central role in helping to organize files and data for many of the higher-ups in the company she worked for. Because she was so highly trusted, and because my dad had his own job at the time, my mom sometimes had me come along on trips to her boss's house so she could keep an eye on me while she organized and went through documents with the poor impaired man. One day during one of these excursions, I wandered into the living room and noticed a familiar sight. Sitting on the floor in front of a large boxy TV, and this was the turn of the century, so for the time period I'm talking a pretty big TV, was an N64 console with a cartridge sticking out of it that had a sword and a colorful shield printed on it. Suffice it to say, my pubescent mind was in a straight-up childlike wonder mode with the possibilities of what this game had in store. It had a cool sword and shield on it, so it had to be adventurous, right? I found myself, with slight hesitation, asking my mom and her boss if it was cool if I could partake. Given that my mom didn't let me play video games at home, I was apprehensive to ask, but Thankfully, my mom's boss was cool enough to reassure her that the game was perfectly alright for someone my age to check out. After a bit of eye-rolling, she gave in and said it was alright, not at all in a tone that made it seem like she thought the devil himself might come out of the screen and possess me. It was time. I remembered as well as I could how to find the right input and turn on the machine like Josh did at his place. Immediately, I was greeted with, and also immediately, I knew that this was a different experience. The tone of the opening felt so serious and grounded in its world. Just the soft musical ballad playing over the sound of horse hooves clomping on the ground gave me goosebumps. I hit the start button and began my adventure. I set up my save file and was launched into story time about a vast deep forest in a land called Hyrule. There was a boy in a green tunic, then a girl on a horse riding dramatically out of a castle gate, then a dark, tall, black armored man on a dark steed following from behind, only to look like he was about to harm this boy. What could all of this mean? Suddenly, we are back in the forest mentioned at the start, and a small fairy is looking for the boy in the intro sequence. She wakes him up to tell him that the self-introduced narrator, the Great Deku Tree, needs to see him. I had so many questions. Who is this great tree? Who is the girl in the intro? Who is the dark man that came out of the castle behind her? Why am I in a tree? So much to figure out. Before I can process all this, I meet a new friend with green hair. She informs me that I am one of these forest-dwelling people, and that I finally have received my fairy after not having one for all this time. I didn't know it at the time, but so much world building had just happened in just a few minutes. I find myself taking control of this green tunic wearing boy, and coming face to face with an open environment full of trees and grass and vines. I proceeded to talk to some of the locals, and I ran into this annoying dude that wouldn't let me continue into the forest to see the Deku Tree that I'm supposed to. I guess it's time to problem solve and get the items that he tells me I need to pass by engaging with this cool environment. It's unlike any game I have ever seen. I could explore anything. I could roll, lift rocks, open chests, and crawl through tight spaces. After using these mechanics for a handful of minutes, I stumbled upon an even bigger chest, and in that chest is every boy's dream plaything: a sword. Now I could do much more than just use my hands and feet. I could fight things. I remembered from my first little bit of faffing about that there was a shield for sale in the local shop, so I continued looking everywhere for more gem-like money. I found the amount needed and got my shield. Now I was truly ready for adventure. I showed the boy blocking the way I meant business with my new arsenal, and finally got deeper into the forest. What I see next is so fascinating. There's a giant tree with a face and a wonderfully huge mustache, and it can talk. The tree tells me of some curse that he's dealing with and asks if I have the courage to take it on. The magic and fantasy of this game grows in my mind. What other strange magical beasts and creatures will await me as I continue? I am about to enter the gaping mouth of the tree when all of a sudden my mother calls me and says that it's time to go. I've reluctantly saved the game and quit despite all the questions and the investment. It would be several long days until my mom would need to go back to the house to help her boss again, and I had the biggest case of blue balls. At least the closest thing a 7 to 8-year-old can have to get back into this game. Eventually, we did end up coming back, and this time I was so much more interested in being dragged to a work-related affair. My next session would solidify my interest in Zelda games forever, as I would be taking on my first dungeon. I picked up where I left off and traversed into the mouth of the Great Tree. I was met with new items to collect, new enemies to dispose of, climbing mechanics, a map to navigate, creatures that would teach me the value of my shield, and I was in heaven figuring out how to move a little closer to completing my quest. I even got a new weapon to use. Little did I know it would help me to clear enemies easier, solve puzzles, to get through more rooms, and eventually take on the root cause of this curse that I was tasked with curing. Recognizing patterns in the mechanics, I was able to eventually take down my foe, and was rewarded with a boost to my health. Given how long it took me to figure all this out as a little kid, it was pretty much time to go after this first epic quest, but I was ready to continue on the next chance I had. I know if you're watching this video, you probably have had this experience yourself in one way or another. So I'm not going to go through all the progression of one of the most iconic video games of all time. I'll just say that in a couple of days of those couple of weeks my mom took me to her boss's house, I learned about who the Dark Man was, the apologetics of the goddess's creation of Hyrule, and what the Triforce was, explored the forest, got my ocarina, explored the castle I saw in the intro, met that little girl and found out that she was a princess, found another town, played with some chickens, dug up some graves, met some rock people, figured out how to use my musical instrument to progress in the game, found my way through yet another dungeon, learned that explosives can be super useful in the process, except against stupid lizard men, and even came face to face with a second dungeon boss. And I beat that dungeon boss. It was literally the last thing I did before I had to leave the comforts of that living room once again. Unfortunately, it would be the last time I would see that living room again. My mom had done all the organizing she could do to help her boss get his affairs in order. She wouldn't have to bring me back there, and my time playing the game would come to an end. I would not know what the rest of Ocarina of Time involved for many years, but the experience would stick with me for a lifetime. I had finally gotten a structured taste of having a say in my own adventure, going to new dangerous places and fighting monsters. As a young boy, I knew there were experiences to be had outside of my small corner of a very large city, not to mention the aforementioned nature areas surrounding that city. This game provided a catered and safe way of imagining what it might be like to take on a large world and the problems and evils within it, and I know I'm not the only one this game did that for. Ocarina will always have an important place in my heart as a Kickstarter for me being excited about the imagined possibilities of what an adventure could be, and it provided a collective understanding for all of us of what it was like to follow an epic story in an interactive medium. Sharing a collective adventure was important for my generation, in an age where the internet was becoming a bigger part of society. It brought many of us together in a love for good stories and epic conflicts. It gave us an understanding that other people feel the same way about art as we do, and that we may not be as different as many dogmas and affiliations might want us to believe. I hope as time goes on that Zelda doesn't become too much of an individual experience. In an age where people are more connected yet more isolated and depressed than ever, we need shared experiences to talk about and relate to each other with. Breath of the Wild took the Zelda experience in such a different direction. And while it has a lot of good qualities, much of the structure of what makes it a staple for understanding the meat of stories was lost. Maybe Tears of the Kingdom will bring back what makes Zelda so amazing in my eyes, and in the eyes of so many others. I can't help but be a bit skeptical though, seeing as how there's so much of the last game being rehashed in the material we've seen so far. But maybe, just maybe, this next game will mix the excitement of what's over the horizon of Breath of the Wild with the childlike wonder of what epic part of the story comes next that was embodied so perfectly in this awesome game that I love called Ocarina of Time. Thank you for watching me reminisce about the developmental years, everyone. What Zelda game made you fall in love with the series, and why? Comment down below what you think of the Zelda formula, and what the best approach should be to make the most effective experience. If you enjoyed relating to any of this, or you just found it interesting, a like would be most appreciated, and feel free to subscribe to get more takes and thoughts on games that I love in the future. Enjoy your day, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Dutch Ritz party.